Hi, thank you for inviting me for the CMIR web, photo blog, video blog. My name is Suma Athreye. I'm a professor of technology strategy at University of Essex in the Essex Business School. And my interests have always been in the area of FDI development, technology transfer. So I do work on the technology sourcing strategies of multinationals, and also when Indian and Chinese firms started to go abroad, then I started to study how they use FDI for asset and resource seeking purposes. The paper is about a phenomenon that we noticed from about early 2000, which was the rapid growth of foreign investment from China and India. Both these countries had opened up, about 15 years before in a major change and shift of policy. So many scholars thought this was quite interesting because they added quite a lot to the world labor force because these were the two most populous economies. What was interesting about the outward FDI from these countries was that it was quite early in their development. And the second thing that was interesting was that it was happening during a period of financial buoyancy. So in 2000, world capital markets were expanding, globalized. And so I was working on the outward investment strategies of Indian and Chinese firms with a colleague, also from Birkbeck College. His name is Professor Sandeep Kapoor. And he's a professor of finance, so he always questioned this emphasis on firm-specific abilities and capabilities. He said, well, this could also just be a financial phenomenon. And our paper is somehow motivated with that observation, because then when the financial crisis happened in 2007, I thought it was an excellent opportunity to observe the impact of financial factors, because suddenly the finance tap was turned off. And here I share a slide here just so that you can see what prompted this kind of rethink. Um, can you see the slide? So you can see that, up until 2005, the two lines, the blue line being China and the green line being India. So the outward FDI from both these countries looks very similar. It's growing, starts from a small base, but the lines are quite, close to each other. But then you have this financial crisis in 2007, and you see this big divergence. The Indian FDI starts to plateau and then marginally decline, whereas the Chinese FDI keeps increasing. So the issue then is that, why did this divergence happen? So that's kind of what I'm trying to explain in this paper that we're discussing. And the fact that the argument we make is that this happened for two reasons. That the structure of financing was quite different in India and China. Chinese firms had a lot of access to state support for going abroad with their investments, part of the China Go Global strategy. But Indian firms did not have this support, so they were forced to rely on internal and external sources of finance, and the financial crisis really hit them very hard. The second factor which was really important was the motives for financing. So we argue that there was an interaction between the motives for financing and the structure of financing, and this produced the divergence of paths that we see in the paper. We always thought that perhaps there's a financial element to the whole expansion of outward FDI from India and China. And so the financial crisis was a good opportunity to observe this. And so that's this idea was there sort of, it was also there in the early papers on FDI from China, where Peter Buckley, for example, has argued that access to finance is a firm-specific advantage. You know, being able to raise finance and access it, especially when markets are financially imperfect. So this idea has been there in the literature, but I think we just use the phenomenon to explore this a little bit more. The first finding of the paper is that the motives for investment matter. So whether your investment is asset seeking or market seeking matters for explaining the direction of FDI, especially because the motives interact with the structure of financing. So by structure of financing, I mean, do you depend on internal sources? Do you depend on sales revenue? Do you depend on borrowing in order to finance your investment? So what we found is that if the motive was market seeking, as was the case for many Indian firms whose foreign investments were mostly trade supporting, so it went in sectors where they already had some competitive advantages through exports. So if your motive was mainly market seeking, then these kinds of investments were more likely to be financed by sales revenue. That is, if you manage to sell more the previous year, then you are allowed to expand your investment in that region. And that makes sense because it's an alignment of incentives. But if your motive was more asset seeking, then of course current revenues would not justify that investment, right? Because you are expecting to make investment in an asset which will give the company advantage over future years. And so in this case, borrowing either from the parent or from the banks or other financial sources might be is often the more preferred way because there's no way to align it just to sales revenue. So what we found is that in fact this explained the pattern of expansion of Chinese and Indian firms. Indian firms were mostly market seeking and they financed their outward investments mostly through sales revenue. But Chinese firms were asset seeking and they were able to finance these investments through borrowing. So when the financial crisis happened, markets contracted because if you remember, many countries went for austerity policies. So investments that were being fed by sales revenues fell. This was the case for India. But investments that were being financed through borrowing, especially in the context of China, where the government decided to follow a counter-cyclical monetary policy. That is, they thought the financial crisis should not starve our firms of liquidity. So we are going to inject more credit into the economy. And so therefore you see this, the growth of Chinese investments. So we are just explaining the phenomenon and those are our main findings. So the structure of financing interacted with the motives really matters. These findings are very useful for both theoretical observations and it's also very useful for managerial policy. So what's the theoretical implications? The theoretical implications are that for the literature on financial market imperfections. So in the literature on financial market imperfections, or in fact many other areas where you're talking about institutions and institutional imperfections, especially with regard to emerging market multinationals, What is often it's implicitly assumed is that somehow the institutional imperfection is a disadvantage. Now, in the case of financial market development, Indian financial markets are probably a little bit more developed than Chinese ones, in the sense that though both economies have immature financial markets, in India at least the financial markets have developed some degree of depth and breadth. They cover many more buyers and sellers. They also cover a larger volume of financial transactions. But this development has not really been that much of an asset for firms that were looking to go abroad, right? Because a better developed financial market will want to avoid a risky situation. So they could not expand their investments by financing it through credit in the same way as Chinese firms could do. So this means that, if when you're theorizing about institutional advantages and disadvantages, I mean, it's important to bear in mind that sometimes immature institutions can offer a greater scope for policy. That's what happened in the Chinese case. And I think from the purpose of, from the point of view of managers, the importance of the structure of financing for the continuation of investments is also really important as a issue. And we have not really in the paper looked at, well, are networks important or not, but we know there's a large literature on the Guangxi networks in China, which enable the raising of finance for firms. So when you're planning outward investments and you want them to be long-lived, then I think it's important to understand what would be the structure of financing of those investments. And I think that's one of the takeaways for managers from our paper.